Okay, so today is part one of a two-part class, God willing. Next week we'll do the second part. And I actually just want to do a straight reading of Megillat Rut, although I know that there is no such thing as straight reading. You're going to see I'm going to read a pasuk and then sort of linger on it and explain it and tell you what I'm thinking. I just have lately been feeling like there's no better exercise than the act of just doing that, of just reading the Pesukim and trying to live inside of them and absorb them and see where they're trying to push our brains. So let's try it together and see how it goes. I hope it's not boring. I think it's a very interesting book. Megillat Rut is only 4 chapters long. I don't know if we could do 2 chapters in a half hour, which is usually the amount of time that we have together. Half hour, 40 minutes. We'll try. If we don't finish, we don't finish, and I'll rush in the second class, but I'll go sort of slow this first one. So the first pasuk of Megillat Rut, which is just to contextualize, Shavuot is coming, and the book that was chosen for us to read on that holiday is Megillat Rut. There's no, Megillat Rut does not reference Shavuot in any way. It's not the story of Shavuot. Shavuot in the Torah is a highly agricultural holiday. It's connected to Pesach because we start counting the Omer on Pesach, and we continue counting for 7 full weeks. These are the 49 days that we're counting, and on the 50th day we celebrate Shavuot. The name of the holiday is weeks. And that's really what it's referencing. It's this journey that you're taking from Pesach to Shavuot. Layered on top of that is this idea that Shavuot celebrates the receiving of the Torah, right? That it's when we stood at Matan Torah. So it's definitely about the connection that Bnei Israel have to getting the laws, to committing themselves to Torah mitzvot, which is why the natural fit is Megillat Rut, which is going to be the story of a woman who, the word that we use in modern life, this word conversion, you could tell that it's sort of not part of any ancient narratives. It's more about a Moabite woman who fully embraces a different way of life and fully connects to the Torah mitzvot. And not only that, who helps other people connect as well. So that's the background. That's why we read Megillat Rut, because of those connections. Both the acceptance of Torah mitzvot, but also because it's a highly agricultural story. Most of the story is set in a field, and that is fascinating to see and indicative of a lot of things. I think, as in, when we analyze a regular piece of literature, we always tell the students, don't get bored during the descriptive passages. If it tells you that it's winter or summer, or if it says that it's cloudy, those things are there for a reason. They're setting the tone, but also they're usually extremely symbolic. So let's begin. Vayhi b'mishvat hashoftim, vayhi ra'av ba'aretz, vayelech ish mibet lechem Yehuda lagor b'snei Moab, hu v'ishto u'shnei banav. Opening lines, and it came to, when is this set? It was, and by Vayhi b'mishvat hashoftim, I think is a very beautiful opening. It's the same as if you're telling your kids a story and you say, once upon a time. It feels like that. Vayhi b'mishvat hashoftim. But it also immediately places you inside of the time period, and it knows that everybody's going to understand that when it says it was the time of the shoftim, that your brain is supposed to layer that with meaning. And what meanings do we associate with the time of the shoftim? It's a time when Bnei Israel are in a very cyclical phase. Things get good and then they get bad again. And each time a new shofet has to come that sort of saves them from the historical moment that they're in. But primarily, the time of the shoftim is known as a time when every man, it was sort of each man for himself. Everybody was sort of trying to figure out for themselves what it meant to live a life in Israel. It was a very tribal time. There was a lot of infighting. So there's a lot of layers here. The other significant thing is that this is before there is a king in Israel. And we know, and if you don't know, then let's say it, that the frame of this entire story is the opening is going to be that it was the time of the Shoftim. The closing line is going to be that David Hamelech, that Ruth is the great grandmother of David Hamelech. So it's going to want you to sort of see those bookends of the sort of the chaotic time of the Shoftim building up to the time of the kings, especially and particularly David. So that's the time period. Vayhi ra'av ba'aretz, and there's a famine in the land. This is almost, a type, a story. This is something that we've seen many times in Tanakh. The idea of a famine in the land, almost common. We know that Israel is a place that, I always say when people say we were gifted the land of Israel, right? If you go to Israel, you have to ask yourself the question, yes, there are very beautiful parts, but there's like a lot of like dust and rocks. I don't know if you've ever like taken a tour in Israel, you like get hot, it's dusty, it's sweaty. Water is not in abundance. And there's this idea that Israel is a place where our survival is very much dependent on a connection, first of all, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because we always pray for water and for the seasons, and it's a part of our daily prayers, that we're very tuned in to nature and its vicissitudes when we live in Israel in ways that maybe other places are not. It's extremely tied into the vicissitudes of nature. And when we say the vicissitudes of nature, as Jews, we believe that conversation is a divine dialogue, that the conversation with nature's whims is a dialogue with the divine himself. Not only that, this idea that when there's a famine in the land, it never really means, or it could, but it's not actually about the fact that there's no food in the land. It's actually about the fact that something is wrong. That usually there's a famine in the nation of Israel. They are in a state of famine themselves. Okay? Any questions? You could let me know. So it's the time of the Shoftim. There's a famine in the land, and now it says Vayelech ish mi Beit Lechem Yehuda. So there's somebody who goes from Beit Lechem. He's from the tribe of Yehuda. We love the irony of the fact that there's a famine in the house of bread, right, in Beit Lechem. But what does he do? He leaves Israel, Lagor b'stei Moav, hu v'ishto v'shnei banav. He goes to live in Moav with his wife and his two children. Say what you will. Many people have so many feelings about this pasuk because they wonder about why did he leave? How could he have abandoned the people of Israel? The pasukim themselves do not indicate any of that. They are blank. All of us live in America, and I think all of us understand the idea of living in exile and of choosing to live in exile and the difficulties of sometimes living in the homeland. He makes a choice. He goes to Moab. Linda Sroor said, is this reminiscent of Lot? To a degree, you're going to see a lot. I mean, these are the layers, the connections between this story and the story of Lot and his journey is going to be significant because who is Moab? Anybody know? If you don't Tanakh moment, Linda, go for it.
His two children that he has with one of the two children that he has with his daughters.
Yes. One of his, it's Ammon and Moab. We know Moab means that it literally means from father, Me'av, because these children were born from this weird moment after the destruction of Sodom. His daughters got him drunk, slept with him, and their children are called that weird connection. They thought that it was basically for them a nuclear war, what they witnessed in the destruction of Sodom. And they said there's no other men alive in the world, so it has to be from our father. So there's something very potently negative in the background of the story of Moab. However, we do consider them our cousins. We have a lot of resentment towards the people of Moab because when we were trying to make our way from Egypt to Israel, They did not give us free passage through the land. They wouldn't give us food and water. They did not show us chesed, right? And we know that all of this is going to resonate in this story. So the minute you hear Moab, your brain must start thinking about Lot, Abraham, going to and from the land of Israel. Who chooses to go to Israel? Who chooses to leave it, and why? Those are very significant questions. Shem Ha'ish is Elimelech. Shem Ishto is Naomi. V'Shem Shnei Ba'arav is Machlon v'Chilion. Efratiim mibeit Lechem Yehuda. Okay, so their names are interesting. The father's name is God is my king. It's a beautiful name. His wife's name is also beautiful, Naomi, which means, pleasant. Their two sons have terrible names. Machlon and Chilion basically mean like death and destruction and disease. So the rabbis do read a lot into this. They're, the Torah is very, very interested in intergenerational loss, in the idea of the decisions that parents make and how it affects their children. That while Elimelech and Naomi maybe began very connected to the Jewish mission and the Jewish people, that in this leaving to stay Moab, it didn't deeply affect their children, and their children are representative of it. Maybe. The alternative is to say that this is not a negative on Elimelech and Naomi at all, that they are actually survivors of a normal exilic period. Jewish history is filled with exile. It's normal. We're always in a state of exile. And the loss that we experience during exile is profound. And the Torah is very tuned into that at all times. And it says that they, Vayamat Elimelech ish Naomi, her husband dies, and she remains. The Tisha'ed is interesting because you'll see in a minute. So she survives. They get married to two Moabite women, Shema Achat Orpah, the Shema Hashenit Rut. Now they get married to these Moabite women. They live there for 10 years. 10 years is an extensive amount of time. Okay, that's not, there was a famine in Israel and we left for a year or two. 10 years is they settled in Moab. They married Moabite women. They went into a different course of life. They shifted into this new lifestyle. But vayamutu gam shnehem, machlon v'chilion. Then the two children also die. Vatishaer ha'isha mishnei yiladeha u'me'isha. Right? She continues to survive after the death of her husband and two children. The idea of a survivor is very significant to this story. Naomi is a survivor. I don't think she's a survivor. I mean, you're reading it with me. You have 100% access to this text, okay? I do not have any secret knowledge that you don't have. We read it together. I hope you see how vague it is in the Torah. It's not telling you a lot. It's not telling you why they died. It's not telling you if somebody here is good or evil or a sinner or not. Can you read into it? Of course you could read into it. But guess what? There were other times in the Torah with a very similar sort of frame, and I'll give you the similar frame because you're supposed to reference it. We spoke about, first of all, we spoke about Lot and the destruction of Sodom. There was no doubt in the story of the destruction of Sodom that Sodom was being destroyed because they were evil. It says it. It also references a very famous story. These are the children of Yehuda. They come from Yehuda. And we have to remember the story of Yehuda and Tamar. Let's remember it for a second. Yehuda, after the incident with Yosef, he is traveling, his oldest son marries somebody named Tamar. His first son dies. His second son also dies. He doesn't allow his third son to marry Tamar because he's afraid of her. The idea of the death of two sons and then and somebody who's surviving that is present in the story of Tamar. In that story, it clearly stated that the sons were not good in God's eyes, okay, that they had sinned. It doesn't hesitate to state that. For whatever reason, it is not stated here that these kids, that these two boys, and that the husband did anything wrong. I think it is implied strongly because you sort of hearing the resonance of those other stories. I prefer when I read this to say, don't think about, if the Torah doesn't give me that information, maybe what it wants me to take away is that it's not my job to figure out the why of this tragedy. And yes, a lot of my mind has been on the tragedy in Meron. My husband told me last night that I have to get off my phone because it does feel like a very personal tragedy. One of the teachers in our school lost her nephew. It's like, it's not even a degree of separation. It's very close. Another teacher, it was her sister's brother-in-law, other people we know. I don't know about the rest of you, but I read an article that people are reacting in two different ways. A lot of people are reacting in, why did this happen? How did this happen? How can we avoid it again? I am certainly one of those people. I'm just like, how could somebody have allowed this to happen? The overcrowding, this tragedy, and I'm angry. And I think whenever we hear about a tragedy, we want to fix the tragedy. Like, we want to go back in time and make that tragedy be gone. We want it to go away. I was thinking, I know three people in the last 3 weeks who tripped and ended up in the hospital needing surgery. They just tripped. They fell down. This idea that how fragile life is, right? There is a part of this story that, yes, I think if you're any good Maimonidean Jew, which I am, Maimonides says, don't blame everything on God. A lot of tragedies are due to human ignorance and human error, and it's our job to get smarter. He's very insistent upon that. However, there's another, and that is a very important part of our Jewish life, Jewish identity. I talk about it, I spoke about it this past year with coronavirus. There is a part of this where we have to say, how do we protect ourselves from disease? How do we have better systems? How do we figure this out? There's no such thing as, well, it's all God's plan and we're just dying in the hospital. No, that's not a thing. We don't say that. And it's not a good Jewish thing to say. Good Jews say, let's plan for the future. That's the fix it mentality. That's like, what did you do wrong? What could we do better in the future? I think Megillat Rut is different. It's sort of not engaging too heavily in the sources of this tragedy. What it's more focused on is, listen, sometimes, not just sometimes, maybe all the time, there's an unexplainable piece to tragedy. There's just a piece of it that just feels removed from human control. In those instances, there are going to be people who survive these tragedies. They're going to be left in a really difficult position. The difficult position is, how are you going now to respond? What direction are you going to move your life in now? Not spending time on the whys of why did this happen, but on the what now and the how, and how do we recover? That's the story of Megillat Rut. So yes, you spend a lot of time trying to figure out why they died. The Torah does not. The focus of this story is not on me. And the emphasis that it's making is Batisha Ed, that she survives. And that's a very difficult position to be in. I'm sorry, there was somebody in the chat just now. All the yeshiva boys in Israel went to one of the funerals. Yes, I think everybody experienced this tragedy simultaneously, right? It's very heartbreaking. So where do we go from here? Let's see where Naomi goes. We know where she goes if we know the story, but let's read it together. Batakom hi v'kaloteha v'tashav misdei Moav. So what happens? She picks herself up, and here I am going to go a little rabbinic and midrashic, because they say the Torah uses a very specific word here. It says v'tashav misdei Moav, that she returns from the fields of Moab. But for them, they also say that at this moment, Naomi is choosing to begin the process of teshuvah, and we say teshuvah actually means to return, to go back to the place that you started from. And I told you, whenever tragedy hits, we try to hit rewind. We want to go back to the minute before it happened and rescue people from that minute, because usually it is something like this, right? This is more of, I would say, an emotional, psychological, spiritual teshuvah, not physical. But Naomi, in this moment of survival, says, it's time for me to go back home. And she says, and then it says, Ki sham'a b'sdei Moav, ki pakad Adonai et amo latit lahem lechem. Why? Because she hears, Ki pakad Adonai et amo latit lahem lechem. That God, does anybody here know what pakad, like if it's a harder one, pakad. Anybody have a reference point for that word? Anybody ever remember hearing it before?
Hakod pakad, let's see.
That's
No.
right. Do you know where, Julie, like, do you know where you're remembering it from?
I guess they were counting.
So
Did they
lifkod is also to count, because it means it's very connected to taking notice of, to note something, to remember it, to recognize it. So when the Torah says pakod bakadati, it actually comes up a lot with Yetziat Mitzrayim. When Yosef dies, he says to his brothers, one day, pakod yifkod, one day God is going to remember us, but it doesn't mean remember, like it's he'll recognize us. It'll be a moment of recognition and return. And in that moment, we're going to be pulled out of Egypt. And that language is repeated here, that God, that God remember, like, I don't want to say remember because it's not exactly that. Daddy, are you listening? How would you use that word if you're there? It says in the English, remembered. I don't know if my dad is listening to you.
Yes, I'm listening. Yeah.
What English word would you use for pakad?
Yeah. All of those words they use are good.
Yeah.
To be aware of, right? And to take note of, and to,
Yeah. And Daddy, I'm referencing Yetziat Mitzrayim. Do you have other significant references with that language?
With Pekad?
Pakad Adonai et Sarah, right? It also says when she
Right.
has a baby, it uses the same language.
Pakod Yevkolim Echem Halitem, but that's more time is there.
That's Yosef, right?
That's Yosef, right?
What about
And-
pakod avon avot abanim?
And
That's the other one.
Poked, that's right. That's the other one where he's Poked,
Yeah.
right? And of course remembering the covenant, right?
Yes.
Right? And
So it's not a random. I guess what I'm saying is it's not a random word. And I think you've noticed this. We only read 5 Pesukim, but in general, when you read Torah this way, basically what you're doing is you're constantly resonating, right? So we said, oh, Moab, resonance. Oh, Shoftim, there's a resonance there. Oh,
Right.
Melech, that's something, right?
Correct.
Vatishaed, not a random word. None of this. Vatashat, Vayishvu.
Right.
They're not. These words are. It's almost like somebody. It's a very short story, Ruth. But the reason why it should take a long time to read is because it's like somebody is setting up crazy traffic signals on every pasuk. That if you're not stopping, they're like, "Oh, you missed all my signposts. I was sending you all these signals."
Right.
Right, Daddy?
It's correct. 100% correct.
Okay,
You're expected to pick up on it, right?
Yeah.
The way you're saying it, yeah.
Yeah. So let's keep. And if I miss something, Daddy, just chime in. So, right. So she picks up and she hears that God has appointed His people again. He's remembered them. Latit lahem lechem, that He's giving them bread again. There's a lot of ways the pasuk could have written that. It could have said to end the famine. It could have, to give them bread means to give them sustenance. Bread is never bread in the Torah. It's always something a little bit more significant. We could go on. So let's keep going. But she leaves the place from where she was. and her two daughter-in-laws are with her. And they start walking on the path to return to the land of Judah. Go, return to your mother's house, right? God should do chesed with you like you've been doing with me. And we find out that with me and with those who died, that what does it mean that they've been doing chesed? Basically, we're finding out that her two daughter-in-laws, first of all, have stuck by her. They're not letting her be all alone in this tragedy. They are Moabites. They could have abandoned their mother-in-law. What connection do they even have? She's a foreigner living in their land. They could go back to their mother's house. They could go back to their father's house. They have somewhere to go, but they stuck by her. And she's saying that is, the word chesed here, we start getting the feeling that it means some type of extreme generosity and kindness, right? That it's about extreme kindness and generosity above and beyond the norm. God should give you rest. Even this word, menucha, is very significant. She says, God should give you rest. Isha lebet isha, vatishach lahem, vatisenet kolam vativetna. Right? You should each. She's basically blessing them that they should each find new husbands. They're probably very young. I mean, people in the ancient world, you get married at age 15, 16? Even not in the ancient world. That's happened in modern life. But 10 years later, they're only about 25, 26. They're very young. They are of childbearing age. These are not old women. Rut and Orpah and Rut are young women. She wants them to get married again and have children. And she tells them, so go find a good life for yourself. They start to cry. And they answer her, Ki itach nashuv la'amech. They say, no, we're going to return with you to your people. She goes, no, please go home. Do I still have children in my womb? Basically, do I still have eggs in my womb that I'm going to give you, that you can have another husband? Because we're getting into the concept of yibum here, right? Where the obligation is on the husband's, on the man's husband's family, like on the father, husband, that these girls should find another spouse from amongst the kinsmen of their husbands, right? So Naomi is telling them, listen, I, Naomi, have an obligation to provide you with another husband. The same way Yehuda had an obligation to find Tamar a husband and to make sure that she had a child, because these are childless women. This is all about the child. It's not really about the husband. It's about that they should bear a child. But she says, listen, I'm old and I can't have children anymore. Again, you hear the resonance? There we are with Sarah again. There we are with Rivka again. There we are with Rachel. All of these mothers who can't have a baby. I can't have a baby. I can't procreate. I don't have a child for you. This is taking a different, more interesting form. Usually it's the woman herself saying, I can't have more kids. Will I be blessed? This is actually a more practical version of that story, where it's the matriarch saying, I'm old. I don't have another kid for you to marry, right? Shovno benotai lechna, right? Ki zakanti mihiyot leish. She says, you have to go home because I am too old to have another husband. Ki amarti, let's say, yesh li tikva. Let's say that I say I have hope. It's just, guys, get excited. I don't know. I always say, I don't know who's listening to this when you're listening to it. But I'll finish the sentence and then we'll come back. Ki amarti yesh li tikva, gam hayiti halayla leish, v'gam yaladati banim, halahen tishaberna, arasher yigdalu, halahen te'agena, v'bilti heyot leish, al benotai, ki marli meod mikem, ki yatz'a bi yad Adonai. 2 pesukim. What is it saying? She goes, listen, let's say I would say, maybe I have hope that I could get married tonight to a guy. Like I find my husband tonight and we get married and we sleep together. And I get pregnant. Okay. She's like, let's say you go to the crazy scenario. What? Are you going to wait for them to grow up? Are you going to wait till they're big enough and then you're going to marry them? Like, this is not going to happen. There's no future with me. And then she ends by saying, listen, you are making me miserable. You are giving me misery. Why? Because the hand of God has been set against me. Very intense, strong phrase. If you're wondering who Naomi, like we just spoke in the beginning about how do you react to tragedy? Like, what's Naomi's reaction to this tragedy? Basically, she's saying, he's punished me. He hates me. He's set his hand against me. That's how this feels to her, understandably so. And she's very bitter from it. And she's experiencing bitterness. And she's basically telling them there's no hope. Now, if you're a good Jew in any way, and you see somebody say, Hayesh li tikva, do I have hope? You've got to say, oh, that's another one of those red lights that in Jewish narratives, it's always going to be about impossible hope. That's going to be our story. That the framework of humanity, of logic, is going to be, this is a hopeless situation. The Jewish response is going to be, don't assume that in the small purview of your human understanding of reality that things are hopeless. The Torah is very worried about despair and hopelessness. I would say, I think I'm going to feel pretty confident in saying it's definitely top three. It's very worried about people entering into a state of despair. It's very worried. I said this last week but it's actually the same thing about narrative. It's very worried about the stories people tell. Like, and by that I mean tell about like lashon hara and spreading evil lies. But I think it's because of the same thing. The Torah knows, like, whatever story you're going to tell yourself about reality, that's going to become reality. So you better be careful. And if your story is about hopelessness, that's what you're going to create, hopeless situations. I was learning this with my son because he's learning it in school. And I said, what does tikva mean? And of course, the despair of my life is that he's like, I don't know, what does tikva mean? I'm like, hatikva, we sing it. That's our song. That's our national song. Our national song is called Hatikva. I was like, do you know what that means? He's like, not really. And then we had to do a whole side lesson. He got so tired. He's like, I just have one test. Why does this have to be a whole lesson on Hatikva? But the point is, that is our national anthem, is the hope. That's what we stand by. So she's very hopeless. Right? Or they start crying again. So what happens? They cry again, and Orpah gives her a kiss and leaves. But Rut sticks to her like glue. And that's the word we use for glue. She sticks by her like glue. Now, I don't know, personally, no bad feelings for Orpah here. Why do people make her out to be a bad guy? Like, for me, she is the normal human being. And I love that she's in the story. And I love that the parallel is there. I don't think the Torah is saying, look how evil Orpah is. She turns around and goes back home. No, the point is that this is going to be a story about extraordinary people, not ordinary people. And that there's no real criticism here for Orpah. She doesn't, honestly, there's nothing wrong with her reaction. It's just that she will not be an agent of change. She is not going to shift the narrative. That's the bell. This is the last time we're going to see her. She's gone. Her life continues. Whereas Rut is going to do something extraordinary and, yes, above the norm for humanity. And that choice is going to change the direction of so many people's lives, And we know that's where we get back to that this is going to lead to the birth of David HaMelech, right? What is the message? Is the message that every single human being has to be extraordinary? No, Linda means only because you're there. I have to like act like I need some feedback. Like, what do you think?
Oop, you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't think the message is that you have to be extraordinary, but I feel like it's that when you're faced with a choice that's difficult, like sometimes the right thing is not the easy thing, and that's the thing that you should choose. And I also feel like they take Orpah and they make her this like bad person. I feel like with kids, I feel like it's just to foil Ruth as like this exceptional person, like you're saying. So how do you make someone look exceptional? You make the person next to them look really miserable, you know?
Right, exactly. I agree with you. I think it's very consciously done. We need Orpah there because the Torah really wants us to see that Ruth's decision is above and beyond. It is extraordinary. But I like the way you framed it, and I think I would frame it the same way. Yes, actually, the Torah is invested in the story of extraordinary people because it wants human beings to believe that they can be extraordinary. It's not that you always have to be or that it's easy, but at least know that you have that degree of power in this world. If you don't think you have power in this world, you're going to be the Naomi of the story. And we're going to see Naomi. Naomi is like the exemplar of Yatsa b'yad Hashem. Yatsa b'yad Hashem means, she's using the Yud-Ke Vav-Ke, but almost like saying, it's all in God's hands. We use that expression, it's all in God's hands. There's a comfort to that. And I think that there's a time and a place for it. But the Torah sort of pushes back against that and says, wait. It's not all in God's hands, actually. It's very, very much about human decisions also. And what decisions are you going to make right now are very significant. What I like about Megillat Rut is that the decision maker doesn't and maybe should not be the person in mourning themselves. That is what I love about Megillat Rut. A person in despair and mourning is not necessarily the person the Torah is here to reprimand or to give a message of hope to. It's actually the stronger people around the tragedy, around the despair, who have some strength that we say, are you going to use that strength to pull these survivors into a more functioning life? That's going to be Ruth's job. And we're out of time, and we will continue. But basically, what I would want the takeaway to be from this is, in the face of tragedy or despair, number one, I don't think we should be spending an extensive amount of time placing blame, getting angry, reprimanding, or even saying dangerous things to mourners and survivors like, you have to be strong, you have to believe in Hashem, there's a plan for everything. Don't worry. I mean, unless it brings them comfort. I always say, if that's comforting, then say it. I always say to the mourner what I think they was best suited. But really what your job is, and what we know our job is, take them food, visit them, give them a phone call, don't let them be lonely. That's the bigger and the harder job of find hope for them. When they can't find hope, you're going to have to help them find it. And you should do that knowing that this is something the Torah stands for. It stands for hope. You're not making up a story of hope in thin air. It's a real story. The Torah God will back that story up if you build it into the reality of the life of those that are suffering. That's a very, I think, difficult message, but also very inspiring one. And we're going to go further into this inspirational narrative and build into like, what does this have to do with Matan Torah when we meet next week? That's the second bell. That dictates my classes. I'm going to stop recording now if anybody wants to talk about that, but it was good to see you guys.
Thank you, Russ. Thank you. And